So, Kemi Badenoch, you've met with a group of survivors from Oldham and Rotherham. What did they tell you?
It was quite shocking. They told me about their experiences with the rape gangs, but the most shocking thing was how they had gone to the authorities multiple times, to the police, and in one particular case, the police actually handed her, a 12-year-old, into the hands of abusers. And that, I think, is extraordinary. So the failure of state bodies, whether it's the police, social services, is one of the areas that I think needs to be looked at much more deeply.
And that will come as part of this national inquiry that you're calling for?
Yes.
And today, Martin Cox, who's the Conservative leader of Bolton Council, he said that his party, your party, made a terrible mistake in not calling for or introducing a national inquiry when in power. Do you agree?
So I think we thought the inquiries that we had started would be enough. People said, why didn't you say anything at the time? I looked at the inquiries and I thought, oh, there's an inquiry taking place. Let's see what it comes out with. And what we've seen is that we've had multiple non-national inquiries. They are not enough. Let's do more. And that's where we need to get to, looking at things that have not been looked at previously. And my view is that there are a lot of people who have to give an explanation for why they failed a lot of these young girls. And also, we need to make sure that this is not happening again. One of the things that the young women in there told me is that they think it is still happening, that they have parents contacting them now who are saying, this is happening to my daughter. So that means the problem is not solved. And it's not about, lots of the recommendations from previous inquiries, which ended up not even looking deeply at grooming gangs. But the other thing that I think is needed is looking at cultural issues. There are two cultural issues which I believe have been identified, two cultural issues. One is on the perpetrator side. Where do these abusers come from? There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of generalization. Many innocent people end up being grouped in with them. But if you look at it, there's a systematic pattern of behavior, not even just from one country, but from sub-communities within those countries, people with a particular background, particular class background, work background.
What background is that?
People very, very poor sort of peasant background, very, very rural, almost cut off from even the home origin countries that they might have been in. They're not necessarily first generation. The jobs that they were doing, taxi drivers, jobs which allowed them to exhibit this predatory behavior. But that's just one side. There's a second cultural issue, which is the culture of silence, the culture of computer says no, the culture of move along, nothing to see here, the culture of this is not our problem, which is on the side of the state. A national inquiry needs to look at the two cultural issues at the same time. There are some places where when people behave in that way, a mob turns up and burns their homes down. And then they know that they can't do that sort of thing. What, for me, is most extraordinary about this case is that clearly these people thought that they could get away with it. That is the thing that we should be looking at. Why did people think that they could do this and get away with it? Because if they didn't think they would get away with it, I'm quite sure we would not be seeing the numbers that we're seeing now. And I'm not afraid to look into this. I don't care what people call me, whether they say I'm jumping on a far-right bandwagon or I'm just doing it for politics. This is something that I've been talking about for a while. I said it in my big leadership speech. This was something I wanted to look at. And as we saw last year with the post office inquiry, sometimes when politicians are talking about things, it isn't until the public take a specific interest that we can really get going. That happened last year with the post office after the drama. I think this is happening again with the rape gangs. And let's, as politicians across all parties, look into this issue.
Now, the response to your demand for a national inquiry from the government has been to say, as you've pointed out, we've already had an inquiry. They say that the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse in 2022 was sufficient. But your own MPs, including, say, Neil O'Brien, have pointed out that ICSA didn't even look at the grooming gang scandal in any specific investigation.
Exactly.
You agree with that? That they only looked at 6 areas, not, say, the 50 that GB News has found this going on?
Yes, geographically, they didn't look at everywhere, but they also looked at so many other things that the rape gangs, the grooming that was taking place ended up being a very small part of those inquiries. That was not my understanding of what had been commissioned. And I'm sure there are many useful recommendations. We've taken up, I think, about 18 out of 20, but there is still more to be done. One of the things that we did do after the ICSA inquiry was set up a gangs task force, and they found 550 perpetrators that had not been caught. That shows that there is still work to do. And the difference between a national inquiry and some of these local inquiries or the ICSA one you described is that you can't force people to turn up and give evidence. And that's why a statutory public inquiry, a national inquiry, is helpful.
The problem with ICSA, though, wasn't that it just couldn't compel people to come. It didn't even look in the right areas in the first place. I mean, this happened under Conservative leadership. Do you accept that the Conservatives failed to focus ICSA? That even though all this revelation was coming out about it, looking at St Helens and Warwickshire, not say Birmingham and Bradford or Rotherham, this should have been told of them. They should have been, you have to look at this.
I think the previous government was trying to depoliticize it. We had an independent, the first eye in ICSA is independent. When you have an independent inquiry, you can't always control what they do. But the fact is, Conservative Party is now under new leadership, my leadership. And as I did, whether it was with getting justice for postmasters, whether it was stopping rapists from being put in women's prisons, rapists pretending that they were women when they obviously weren't, fully intact men, whether it was stopping mostly gay autistic children from being sterilized under the cover of trans when they needed different help, I don't keep quiet when I see something that's going wrong. I am now the leader of the Conservative Party. We're going to be doing things differently. This is an issue I personally care about. I have been a young girl. I've been a young woman. I have 2 daughters. This stuff terrifies me, knowing that it is still happening and no one is doing anything about it. If I don't do something about it, then who will? Because the government wants just to carry on the way we were going. We've seen that that wasn't enough. We should all get together, all parties, and sort this together.
Earlier this afternoon, Sarah Champion, the MP for Rotherham, she's come out in favour now of a national inquiry, despite voting against one last week. What would be your message to the other Labour MPs who may, like her, have been considering over the weekend breaking with the Labour Party and Sir Keir Starmer and backing now an inquiry?
I would say that this is not about us politicians. It's not about your party whip or what Keir Starmer wants to do. This is about those victims who deserve justice, the survivors who deserve justice, about making sure that every single perpetrator we can find is caught and brought to justice, and those who failed in their duty to protect children are held to account and exposed. And an inquiry means that they have to come out and explain what they did or what they didn't do, and then the truth will out. This is about getting the truth, and everybody should stand for that.
Over the weekend, it was revealed that many of the councils in areas where these abuse gangs have been operated had adopted an Islamophobia definition that said referring to Asian grooming gangs was a form of racism. Do you think that any council adopting that approach is silencing dissent, silencing whistleblowers and survivors?
I think that if you adopt that definition, you are allowing silence to prevail. That definition is not right for this country. We have freedom of religion in this country. We do not have blasphemy laws. We have free speech in this country. We do not have anyone using religion as a cover for illegal activity. And we are not going to allow a culture of silence to prevail, allowing people to get away with things because there's political correctness or whatever sort of identity politics means that you can't call out behaviour. And it doesn't matter who is doing it, what their identity is. We need equality under the law in this country. There's no special treatment for any special group or for any different group. We should all be treated the same. And if people are doing things and they come from a particular group, that should be exposed. And that means that it is actually easier for people of that community to speak out.
One of the main concerns I've heard from survivors over the years covering this is that all too often their perpetrators just aren't deported. They are foreign nationals or dual nationals. They commit these heinous acts of abuse, but nothing happens. Now, in 2012, one man, Curry Ralph, a ringleader in Rochdale, he was convicted of being an abuser, but he used ECHR and human rights legislation to avoid deportation. Does that concern you, that that happened under the Conservatives? And would you try and change the law to ensure that all grooming gang offenders are deported?
We need to do everything we can to make sure that offenders are deported. I think it's absolutely disgusting that foreigners can commit crimes in our country and get away with it, and there is no sanction, or where there is sanction, they're still allowed to mingle in the communities where they've committed these crimes. If the ECHR is the problem, that needs to be fixed. But my view is that it goes well beyond that. There's lots of stuff that goes on within judicial sentencing that a lot of people out there don't understand. Even legislators don't understand, and it needs to be looked at. These are the things that we need to look at, where we put in laws, and yet people are still not put in prison or deported. And we brought in some extra laws just last year to help us deal with this specific problem of deportations. I think these are some of the things that Labour has been reversing. And I would call on Yvette Cooper and Keir Starmer to look at some of the legislation which they were voting against last year and see that actually we need these powers in order to keep our communities and our country safe.
In the debate at PMQs last week, you raised the concern that politicians could be implicated in the cover-up. Do you think that might be behind part of the reason why the Labour Party is resisting this investigation?
Well, it's certainly something that we have to look at. I don't understand why, when there is so much support, even from their own MPs, Andy Burnham is another person who said we need a national inquiry, Paul Waugh, Sarah Champion, Dan Carden, more and more people are coming out on the Labour side. And we cannot have a culture of fear. I am not afraid. The Conservative Party is under new leadership. What we did before to tackle it is clearly not enough. We need to do a lot more, and Labour needs to get on board with that. And if they don't, I think that they will have very serious questions to answer from the electorate when the time comes.
One more question. You've met a few survivors today.
Yes.
What would be your message to the many thousands of survivors of these appalling gangs around the country who may be quite terrified, frankly, of this debate restarting in the country and nervous about what could be happening next?
My message to them would be that I know many of you will be nervous. I know many of you will be afraid. But having spoken to some of you, I know that you want justice and you feel let down that the people who should have looked after you did not look after you, and that needs to change. And I'm going to do everything, and the Conservative Party is going to do everything to make sure that you get justice.
Kemi Badenoch, thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlie.